I was a bit late to seeing Barbarian, but after finally watching it, I gotta say, I'm speechless. If you've seen my horror tier list, then you already know that, but there are some films where you wish you could wipe your memory and then watch them again without knowing anything, and Barbarian is 100% in this category. The film is without a doubt a horror movie first and foremost, but it also has some really unique quirks and narrative choices that make it more than just a horror movie. It may sound weird at first, but after seeing Barbarian, I can't help but notice a connection between this movie and Tarantino's classic, Pulp Fiction. The two may seem completely different, and thematically they are, but when it comes to their structures, the two have more in common than what initially meets the eye. So without any further ado, let's get into how Barbarian is the new Pulp Fiction of the horror genre. I mentioned that thematically these movies are different, and to be fair, they are. Pulp Fiction is all about divine intervention and the nuanced portrayal of its characters by breaking their stereotypes and offering poetic dialogue. Barbarian, on the other hand, is a clear take on the patriarchy, stereotypes, and how people in the projects are treated as animals. But what these two films have in common is their story structures. Pulp Fiction consists of three distinct storylines united by a common shared element. The three storylines are Vincent's, Butch's, and Jules' storylines that are all interconnected by the shared element of Marcellus Wallace, or the briefcase if you want to look at it that way. Barbarian also has three distinct storylines. These being Tess and Keith's awkward housing situation, AJ Gilbride's allegations and quest to flip his properties, and Frank's fucked up tendency of having incestuous babies in his basement. The shared interlinking aspect between these three stories is the house that appears in the movie, or more specifically, the basement. The way I personally like to think of these films that have three separate but interconnecting stories is like an older painting style that was known as triptych paintings. These paintings are composed of three separate paintings that are united by a shared theme, and their frames are placed adjacent to one another. Usually the center painting is the largest and has the most emphasis given to it, and the right and left sides are usually equal to balance out the centerpiece, and these two sides amount to half of the painting, with the center painting making up that other half. I feel like these proportions can be roughly, again, not exactly, but roughly be applied to Pulp Fiction and Barbarian. In Pulp Fiction, the most prominent character who has the most screen time is Vincent Vega. He is the only character who crosses into the other characters' storylines. What I mean by this is that Vincent talks to Butch and Jules, but Jules and Butch never actually have a dialogue to word one another. There is one scene in all of Pulp Fiction where Jules, Butch, and Vincent are in the same place, and this scene is in the bar where Marcellus Wallace is bribing Butch to take a dive in his boxing match. But my point here is that Butch and Jules never interact in the scene, and in the movie, they're never even seen on camera in the same shot together. Vincent, on the other hand, interacts with both, and this makes him the bridge that interlinks the two. Going back to the triptych painting, this would make Vincent the centerpiece of the movie. After Vincent, Jules and Butch make up the left and right sides of the painting. In other words, they are supporting pieces that complement Vincent's painting, but they are not as emphasized as him. In terms of the three-story structure of Pulp Fiction, Vincent's storyline is the largest and most explored. And Butch and Jules' storylines serve as a way to explore their own themes and ideas, but also to directly complement Vincent's storyline. When it comes to Barbarian, the proportions are a bit less clear, so I went through and counted. In terms of individual screen time, that is when the three characters, Frank, AJ, and Tess, don't share the screen together. Here is the breakdown. The first 43 minutes of the film are entirely Tess. Then there is a cut, and the next 23 minutes are AJ. Only 6 minutes of the film are used for Frank's story. From here, there is far less individual screen time as the characters converge, but there are still 8 minutes where Tess grazes the screen by herself, specifically when she tries to notify the cops, but besides this, the rest of the movie is made up of 2 characters constantly being on screen, whether that be Frank and AJ, or Tess and AJ. Now, these proportions I laid out for you are still roughly in line with the idea of a triptych painting, as Tess is clearly the centerpiece, with AJ and Frank being complementary pieces, but also having their own elements and their own stories that make them distinct. What's also interesting is that, similar to Pulp Fiction, 2 of the characters in the triangle never interact with one another. Tess never sees or talks to Frank, only AJ directly interacts with the other 2 characters, similar to how Jules never talks to Butch and Vincent becomes the connecting link between the 2. Now, the proportions for Barbarian aren't a perfect 25%, 50%, and 25% as is seen in most triptych paintings, but the movie's structure still fits into a 3-parted artwork that a triptych is supposed to be. So structurally, these movies are very similar, but there is another key aspect worth mentioning when it comes to the storytelling of both movies. Both Barbarian and Pulp Fiction are told out of chronological order. Barbarian has a relatively normal story structure, but an hour and 6 minutes into the movie, we get what seems to be a random flashback, which is actually Frank's story. Pulp Fiction, on the other hand, deals a lot with flashbacks, but the story is much more ambitious with its non-linear storytelling, and the cuts are much less intuitive. Just for example, we see Vincent die after Butch finds him in his bathroom, but we still see a lot more of Vince throughout the rest of the movie. This lack of normal storytelling, along with both films having 3 plot lines going on at once, adds to the unique feels of both movies. The overwhelming majority of movies have 1 to 2 plots going on at once, with the main plot and the subplot. Pulp Fiction is a big departure from this, as it elects to have 3 plots happening at once that coincide with one another to a certain extent. Barbarian is similar, but to a lesser degree, as its 3rd storyline, Frank, is clearly emphasized much less when compared to how much attention Pulp Fiction gives to its characters. Nonetheless, these 3 plot structures, along with not telling the stories in their exact chronological order, unite the films in feeling volatile and unpredictable. Although I would say Barbarian feels much more chaotic than Pulp Fiction in regards to its writing. There were moments during Barbarian where I was wondering if the right movie was playing, and the prime example of this is when Barbarian goes from having Tess and Keith trapped in the basement to AJ living the high life just before getting the call concerning his allegations. Another example of this could be when we cut to Frank's story, because the camera lens completely changes and you can visibly see the aspect ratio on screen completely shift. The camera also follows Frank in a way that no other character gets followed, and there is this weird, almost fisheye look to this sequence. The reason behind these erratic jumps in Barbarian can be explained through Zach Cregger's writing process for this movie. He went into this movie without an outline and just wrote whatever he wanted to have happen next in the movie. And this makes a lot of sense in explaining the chaos in Barbarian structure, especially when you look back at those moments I mentioned. But besides structure, there is a lot more going on that closely relates Barbarian to Pulp Fiction. One key narrative technique that both films use is a misdirect as to who the real antagonist or villain is. In Pulp Fiction, it's clear that Marcellus Wallace is the mean bad guy that everyone fears. In Barbarian, the mother is the villain who traps whoever enters into her basement. By the way, I'm not going to show the mother in her entirety because I obviously don't want to get taken down for nudity, but she low-key a baddie. But neither of these characters, Marcellus Wallace or the mother, are truly evil, and the films redeem both of these characters toward the end. In Pulp Fiction, Marcellus Wallace and Butch get trapped in the basement of the pawn shop owners who rape and torture them. It's here that the film shows us that Marcellus isn't really a bad guy because he acts with a purpose. He may be going after Butch, but at least he has a rational reason to, and this is the anger he feels from Butch stealing his money and not taking the dive as they had negotiated. The pawn shop owners, on the other hand, have no real reason or motive to torture and abuse Butch and Marcellus, and they simply do it for their own amusement. This is a huge reason why Butch spares Marcellus, because he realizes that Marcellus isn't truly evil. He is just acting out of his own moral compass, whereas the pawn shop owners seem to be devoid of any such thing. Tarantino uses a misdirect here as to who is truly evil, and Krager does the exact same thing in Barbarian. If you've seen the movie, which you probably have considering you're watching this, then you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. The mother comes off as the evil monster, but we later find out that she is showing love in the only way she knows how, and this is by nurturing people and thinking of them as her babies. The real evil in the basement is Frank, and this is exactly what Andre says when he tells Tess that the mother is the least horrible thing in the basement. The mother also protects Tess at the end of the movie, which clearly shows that she is a good character, albeit her idea of good is disoriented since she has the mental capacity that only a 8th generation incest creature thing can have. The real evil in Barbarian is clearly Frank, since he abducts women and videotapes their abuses, then he does a lot of other crazy things which I won't delve into for the sake of not puking, but you get the point. Frank is evil without a cause, whereas the mother acts out of self-defense and she protects Tess, who she views as her baby. In this sense, both Pulp Fiction and Barbarian hide their true antagonists, with Marcellus Wallace and the mother not really being evil characters upon further investigation. The true villains in Pulp Fiction turn out to be Zed, the Gimp, and Maynard from the pawn shop, and in Barbarian, the true villain turns out to be Frank. These villains are the true antagonists because they are evil for the sake of it. But besides utilizing the narrative technique of misdirecting who the true antagonist is, these two movies have some more things in common. Another aspect worth mentioning is that both Pulp Fiction and Barbarian are satires of their genres. Both films subtly poke fun at their genres, and they challenge the stereotypes that are associated with crime and horror films. Let's start with Pulp Fiction. The tough guy gangsters turn out to be some of the nicest guys in the movie. We see how Vincent treats Mia, and Jules decides to take the moral high road when it comes to Pumpkin and Honey Bunny. Jules also seems to drastically change throughout the movie as he goes from being a hitman for the mob to being a man of faith towards the end. This is another departure from the tough guy stereotype, as Jules shows moments of hints of vulnerability throughout the movie. When it comes to Barbarian, the subversion of genre stereotypes are much more obvious. The mother clearly resembles monsters from any horror genre, but as we learn more about her, it becomes clear that she's a victim, and her actions are actually meant to be positive. Unlike Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, or Chucky, who all do things for the sake of being evil, the mother's actions are actually caring as she thinks of those who wander into the basement as her children that she has to provide for. Frank, on the other hand, comes off as the most normal character in the movie, as he is the typical middle-class man from his time period. But the more we learn about Frank, it becomes obvious that he is the most sinister character in the film. There are also plenty of other smaller examples. Keith comes off as a creep during the beginning of the movie, but he actually turns out to be the nicest character in the film. The man who chases after Tess during the daytime is actually trying to protect her, and the cops who are supposed to be the ones to protect Tess don't actually care. Another interesting reversal of genre tropes in Barbarian is with the use of daytime and nighttime. Tess only finds out how dangerous and run down her neighborhood is during the daytime. During the night, Tess is actually protected by the mother, as we see during the end when she jumps for Tess. This is a strict departure from the horror genre, where daytime usually means safety and nighttime means danger. These are just some examples of the films challenging their genre conventions, but there's also some more elements in these movies that point to satire. Pulp Fiction has a lot of comedy, and many times that comedy comes into the most tense scenes in the film. Just take the Kahuna Burger scene for example. What is an extremely tense scene is disrupted for a little bit by humor, as Jules focuses on the burger. Marvin's death is another example. An extremely dark, gruesome scene is made enjoyable to watch by the humor that's on display through Vincent's nonchalant attitude about the whole thing. The last example I will give is Marcellus Wallace and Butch in the basement of the pawn shop. The most gripping scene in this movie is made hilarious when it turns out that the captors just so happen to be a group of closeted homosexual rapists. In Barbarian, the moment that I found the most funny was with AJ measuring out the basement and finding out if he could add the extra area to his house listing. I love the contrast between Tess's reaction to the basement and AJ's, and for me, this really brings light to the idea that one man's trash is another man's treasure, and we see this message repeated throughout the film. The mother is the physical embodiment of the saying, as she is trash for some, but for Tess, she's her savior. I love how both films are able to incorporate comedy so effortlessly, and having humor is something that is rare in both crime and horror movies. The last thing I want to talk about is how both movies play off trends and conventions of their time. Barbarian dabbles with the Me Too movement, and it offers justice by literally gouging the eyes out of a celebrity who turns out to be a rapist. On the other hand, Pulp Fiction dabbles with the death of God in American society. The 90s were a time where the secularism of America was becoming stronger and stronger, and Pulp Fiction calls into question how seeming divine interventions can be rationally justified. It also shows how the morals from a religion can make someone into a better person, and we see this when Jules adopts a new moral code and spares Pumpkin in the restaurant. There is a lot more to be said on Pulp Fiction and religion because the movie can be interpreted as a visual Bible, but that analysis is for another video. It seems though that both movies got their main themes and ideas from issues that were prevalent during their time. Barbarian took the Me Too movement and used it as a way to make a commentary about the patriarchy and the selfish attitude that some celebrities exhibit. Pulp Fiction took its audience who were dealing with an increasingly a-religious America and made them consider how some events lack a rational explanation. Overall guys, Pulp Fiction and Barbarian are completely different movies on the surface, but a deeper look shows how their structure and sources of themes are eerily similar. It's through both of these films' three story structures, lack of chronological storytelling, misdirects towards evil, tackling of stereotypes within their genres, incorporation of comedy, and inspiration from relevant issues in each of their time periods that Barbarian and Pulp Fiction managed to be two peas in a pod. Both of these films are great in their own genres, and both do a great job of making something new out of their genres. Now, Barbarian may not be as influential, revolutionary, or original as Pulp Fiction, but it's still a great movie, and hopefully it gets the level of recognition that it rightfully deserves. But for now guys, let's pay our respects by taking the time to admire the genius of both films. Hopefully I was able to clearly explain why for the horror genre, Barbarian is the new Pulp Fiction. Guys, that is all I have for this video. Please let me know your thoughts over the connections between Pulp Fiction and Barbarian in the comments below. Do you think I'm being too cynical and reaching for similarities, or do you think there is a parallel to be drawn between both of these movies? I look forward to reading through what you guys have to say, and this video took a fucking long ass time to make, so if you wouldn't mind showing some support, that would really mean a lot to me. And as always guys, if you made it this far, thank you, I love you, and I genuinely hope that you have a great rest of your day.